so much for joining me on Culture Chat again. It is such an honor to always have you on our show.
It's great to be back.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Well, by chance, this became our anniversary because, of course, last year we talked on International Women's Day, now we are celebrating once again. It's March already, and I thought, what better guest to have on than, the most powerful. We love our,
one of many,
our POC like reps.
In this community.
Yes,
absolutely.
So as a representative, you've been doing so much, but of course, because it is International Women's Day, there's so much going on, and it's also was the last couple weeks a huge win for the Me Too movement with the first criminal conviction of Harvey Weinstein. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So what are your thoughts on that?
It's funny because the last year there definitely have been like historic moments of empowering women and girls, and yet I still think there's so much more work to do. Without a doubt, the Me Too movement has continued to leave its mark, and I do think that the criminal prosecution of Harvey Weinstein is a deep reminder of the power of speaking your truth, of seeking justice. And so too many cases, those that seek justice do not have it served to them. And of course, too, it does tend to be the folks of more wealth are listened to more. In the case of Harvey Weinstein, many of his accusers were people that, one reason why it attracted global attention was because these were really powerful, successful women sharing their stories, and so it was harder to dismiss their perspectives compared to so many other women who are going to be housekeepers or restaurant workers, farm workers, and when they share their stories, they're not always as honored and lifted up. Even our college women who experience, rape on campuses and sexual assault on campuses. And so, I'm hopeful that the fact that there was justice served, that will continue for folks of every economic class. But I also know that it continues to take the work of activists, of local elected officials, of community leaders to also trust survivors, lift up these stories. And it reminds me of a local situation we had where the Reverend Brian Fullwider was accused of child abuse by an individual who has remained anonymous, and she shared her story. And Winter Park Police actually conducted a controlled call, and he was arrested, and then he went on bail and took his life. And so she will never have the type of justice. And even during that time, people called her a liar. People went out of their way to try to hurt this storyteller. And so again, that reminder of we have to trust survivors, and we have to create really strong reporting tools, make sure law enforcement are trained how to manage situations of sexual assault and domestic violence. And so, improvements, but still a long way to go in ensuring that every survivor is listened to. And then, of course, we just prevent sexual abuse in the first place.
Right.
Which is down to consent education for young people. Absolutely. And, ensuring that folks see something, say something too.
Absolutely. I know that it has definitely been a point of contention, something really important to me, because I would say over a year ago or so, was the first time I shared my story about childhood sexual abuse. And, and I really felt that it was just so empowering that other people were kind of helping lift you up and share their stories. And so it's not even just about, it is about the justice, of course, but I think just even allowing women to feel like it's okay to share, because that's really been, I think, the hardest thing because of culture, because, the college, like you said, the college campus is one of the worst where, most women really do not feel that they can say anything because they won't be believed.
Totally. And I have goosebumps just listening to you talk about the importance of sharing your story and then honoring those who share their stories. And it reminds me, I'm talking to a mom right now whose daughter experienced campus sexual abuse by a athlete. And so they sought justice. The school suspended this student, but the student was able to go to a different school and still play sports in a different school. And so Good Morning America has done investigative reporting on it. And apparently there's dozens of student athletes who have been accused of sexual assault, proved to have done wrongdoing, and so the school will not let them play anymore on their campus, but they just transfer to a different school and keep playing athletics.
Yeah.
And, it's that's not okay, right?
Not okay.
Playing sports is a privilege.
Absolutely.
And so another incident, right, of just areas of improvement that we have to be really courageous about talking and addressing. And I do think there's still backlash. I mean, especially
I was just gonna ask about the backlash.
The online world, like the trolls are so aggressive, and when folks share their stories, they're met with resistance. And I we have yet to see what the impact of the Me Too movement will be on this campaign cycle. But we're already hearing about presidential candidates on the Democratic side facing different types of Me Too stories, if you will. And I definitely think it's like this weird dichotomy where like you have folks who stand in solidarity, and then you have folks that like really, really just deny storytellers adamantly. And sometimes it's on generational lines, cultural lines. So, it is definitely nuanced, but I'm a firm believer in sharing your story of sexual abuse reaps little benefit. It's really, really hard to do that. And the backlash is often worse than any type of justice you might be able to seek. And right now in the Florida Legislature, there is a bill moving along that would eliminate the statute of limitation of the rape of minors. Unfortunately, it's not retroactive. So for folks who've experienced abuse in their past.
It's past the statute.
Right. But for this moving forward, it would allow any young person who might experience abuse today, that they would be able to report that into adulthood, no matter how many years have passed. And so I am hopeful that this will become law and that Florida can join other states in at least putting, that directive to say, if you've experienced child abuse, that you don't have to feel like there's a time to when you can actually share.
Yeah, because I feel a lot of people who are looking in from the outside, especially from my personal experience, don't understand, well, why? Why do you wait 20 years or 10 years or 5 years? They really don't understand the trauma, and there's no comparative, but I would imagine people who have experienced any type of PTSD or anything would be able to kind of have a gauge of, well, you're not really ready mentally or emotionally to address everything right away. And
100%.
Hopefully, as we progress in time, like with wonderful people in office like yourself and helping pave the way, that each generation, it gets a little easier for.
It really does. And I'm so proud of like the Gen Zers like coming after us, because like their approach to this subject is so unapologetic and bold, and I almost feel like you're gonna see reporting be hopefully over time become more common in the time span, because I do think we're also, this next generation is building a culture of accountability when it says, it's not okay for you to send me a dick pic. It's not okay for you to treat me like this at the office. Like there's different, like I think the standards of equity are redefining themselves to actually reflect what they should be. And when you compare, these same situations taking place in the 70s and 80s, I think there was more of a culture of silence. Absolutely. And that's still very present today, but I think young folks more often than past generations are challenging it. And just like they're challenging issues of climate change and gun regulation and so many other topics. So I'm very hopeful that you'll see, and not just folks reporting it, but you'll see better actions by former perpetrators, right? Like so many young hetero men today, and folks of any gender and sexuality, are understanding consent more, and watching what's happening in the news cycle and realizing, wow, like, have I made those type of mistakes in the past? Like, have I been offensive to someone? And kind of reflecting on that and seeking a path of restorative justice, while also focusing on, how do I not do that? How do I be a better human?
Yeah. And like you were saying earlier, you touched on just that early education in general. But I think, one of the things for me was, as a Chinese American, I mean, there was no sex education in the home. I don't know what it was like for your household, but like it was so taboo. You maybe get something in middle school for like 20 minutes,
but
it's
it's more hygiene.
And it's so unfortunate, because by then it's also too late.
Totally.
By then it's too late. And so what has been amazing for me has been just a few people that have reached out and said, you know what? I'm talking to my 2-year-old about body awareness. I'm not using like random symbolism. Like, no, be really clear.
These are the body parts.
Be very clear, and be very clear who is allowed to be near them and what is okay. I mean, you think about the gymnast and all these things.
Right.
So I think we are doing better just by even the conversation we're having now.
Absolutely.
But I'm hoping anyway that, like you said, the Gen Zers and the generations now don't kind of have that same don't speak about it.
Totally.
They'll figure it out one day.
Well, and I want to honor your point about the cultural diversity of it. And I think it's so important that women of color are talking to communities of color, right? Yes. That it's not like an outsider coming in, but that Absolutely. It's peer-to-peer, because I mean, as an Iranian-American, I can relate. Yes. We never talked about sexual health education at all. And my mom passed away when I was 13 as I was beginning my period. And so I had no context for healthy relationships, no context for consent. Really felt almost like you don't want to be that girl, right? That stops him or says something, and so though you're uncomfortable, right? You were uncomfortable, but you never actually gave consent, right? But you didn't adamantly say no because you didn't want to be labeled as that girl. So that shame still hovers today. I mean, we still have so much work to do, and unfortunately, Florida is a pretty absence only type of state. So, we're very much still grounded in this notion of don't talk about sexual activity and just stress abstinence, which we know doesn't work. And what ends up happening is that you're really setting this uneven atmosphere for young people where based on their zip code, they might have more knowledge on consent than others. And that's not okay. Consent education needs to be clear, across the board. And I love your point about body parts, it's just biology, right? It's just that simple.
Science. I mean, we're now embracing science, and I mean it's a real thing.
And good touch, bad touch, right? Basics, so that if a young person needs to ask for help, they can. Yeah. And I know they just have defined as a trusted adult to go to, and especially to your mention of sports. I mean, and the Me Too movement also, we saw things show up in the arts field. We saw stories in camping environments, Boy Scouts. The Boy Scouts recently just declared bankruptcy because of child abuse lawsuits.
Wow.
Unbelievable. And I mean, and even different places of faith are facing similar bankruptcy situations.
When you mentioned the whole, the sports, athletes going from school to school, it just really rang a bell because, I was raised Catholic. And so I have a lot of issue with the way that priests were moved around, and because that is okay. You would just be moved location. And there's just no consequence and there's no action, and it's so not okay. And I didn't want to spend the whole time on this, but we're really on a roll here. So
it's so important.
It's so important, but it is, and I feel people don't seem to understand that it's not just okay because it's a priest. It's we give them a pass or anything like that. And I'm even more so they should be held to a higher standard if they're an authority figure. And there's always been these arguments that I've had with people of faith, different faiths, and saying, well, maybe they need to be married. I said, no. A sexual predator finds himself or herself in a position of power over people, and then becomes a predator. It's nothing to do with the rules of this or that. I said, predators are predators, and we need to identify them, and we need to make sure that they are convicted and that justice is served. So it just,
and you were talking
really
to someone too who, I mean, we do a lot of work in the prison system. So in the last year, I have visited 3 prisons in Florida. We have focused a lot of our legislative priorities on not only making sure that there is justice in cases of sexual abuse, but also in reducing mass incarceration, because we do have so many arrests of people who are nonviolent offenders, who are there on drug charges or theft charges because they have a drug addiction. And so I do think it's really important that we're thoughtful to prosecution as a whole and giving power to judges, but you cannot have any flexibility on this issue. Child abuse is child abuse. No excuses.
There's no gray line because of course, like you said, people who have drug addiction, and also, of course, when you're dealing on this grand scale and all these things, you are harming others. But a lot of the time, there's so much that it's a matter of priority, right? So it's a matter of priority in what the community needs the most, and where the community is being damaged, quote unquote, the most. And it's putting out fires, and I can't imagine what you guys go through on a daily basis because you can't address them all, and then you get criticized for being soft on this or being too hard on that and not caring about different issues. I mean, how do you kind of find that balance? I mean, you've done so much since the last year. I've been following you, and there's been so much, but how do you deal with those issues that are constantly rising up where it's prioritizing?
It's a great question. I mean, I'm very blessed to have a small but mighty team. So as a state house representative, we only have 2 staffers, and then myself. So we all wear multiple hats. And I do think our prioritization is very much based on like emergency versus like long-term policy goals. And so the reality is that in the legislative cycle, policy takes time. And so we're going to see small wins. We're going to see important wins. For example, increasing arts and culture funding by 800%. We were able to secure money for human trafficking prevention here in Central Florida. We were able to slow down some bad bills, make some bad bills not as bad, and and do our best on the policy front when it comes to legislative issues. But we really do prioritize like constituent cases, and we'll get constituent cases sometimes about situations like this, or we'll get cases about homelessness, cases about folks being terminated at their jobs, and we get every type of story from our district, and we attract folks from outside of our district because we are so responsive. So I have an entire caseload right now of situations about misdiagnoses of child abuse that I need to get to that folks are waiting for my response on. And so it can be a challenge, but since we're in the middle of legislative session, you kind of have to focus on the urgency of things moving through session while also maintaining the constituent caseload and not leaving constituents waiting for session. So a lot of it's moving all at once, but I will say if there are some folks who email us, reach out, who have policy ideas, and we'll typically ask them to wait till after session when we can think about the next session, because at this point too, it's too late for new bills to be considered. And so we kind of basically try to do it. We prioritize constituents and we prioritize urgency. If there's something that really is a crisis right now, then we want to be there for you.
Awesome. And the last time we spoke, the thing I really remember was your very positive outlook on being able to reach across the aisle and having a lot of good dialogue between across different parties. And I think this is 2020 and everybody is so on edge. It is a huge election year for everyone. Totally. But the big one, right?
Totally,
and so with that, tensions rise, and you just you're not really quite sure everyone's as civil as they once were. Maybe like a couple years ago where we just felt like, well, we're kind of here. And then, of course, with the impeachment, how is it even possible to deal with those tensions? Or has it gotten worse?
It's a good question. It's definitely becoming more challenging. And I think we have to be really intentional about at the state level, like not letting the federal news cycle impact us at a state level. And even during the impeachment hearings, Tallahassee was pretty quiet on it. Tallahassee folks were not really talking about impeachment. We're very much focused on just addressing the bills in front of us. But of course, like the tension around the globe and, in our neighborhoods was quite palpable. I mean, we would see in Tallahassee folks protesting in downtown Tallahassee to impeach Trump. I mean, you can see the tension among the greater public. And I think it's our job to be very clear where we stand on this issue, but to also not just talk about impeachment. And even if you looked at our social media during that time, I was very careful to not post too much about impeachment in our main Facebook page, because I wanted to really give attention to the other local issues that could get drowned out because of the impeachment hearing. So we would post like the major updates about impeachment, but you didn't see us like every 10 minutes, every hour, like impeachment updates. Like we would kind of post the summaries and things like that. So I think it's also about just how do you use your platforms with what you share. And then just between our colleagues, there has been some tension on some pretty important issues. I mean, in particular, this session, we've seen LGBTQ issues become a little partisan and a little hyperbolic. And then we've also seen abortion issues kind of, hit the tension points. But I do my best to maintain an energy of civility. And I think that when leaders demonstrate that, it helps to keep the environment more calm. And even one of my colleagues who was really aggressive towards me on Twitter, focused on LGBTQ issues, I was very calm with him and really straightforward. And just the other day we were texting each other, trying to find time to, grab coffee to talk. So I feel really grateful that despite the bursts, the bursts of tension, we kind of maintained civility along the way, and work very closely with our budget chairmans and our budget chair women and our speaker to try to find those common ground and to make sure we're passing a budget that's in the best interest of all Floridians. And unfortunately, the bills moving forward, pretty rough in most cases. There's some pretty bad bills moving forward, and we're filing amendments. We're doing our piece to ensure that the right issues are talked about, but we never do it with a personal attack in mind. Yeah. And I think that's the difference too.
Yeah, and I feel like there's just this gap. So there are so many important things going on. Of course, the impeachment was important, like you said, but and that's just an example. I mean, if we like rewind anywhere, our president often does this kind of means of distraction, and it's like, hey, look over here while I pass all these other crazy things, and now we're gonna just pollute the lakes and oceans.
I was literally gonna say environmental issues. It's wild how many like deregulations of the EPA this president has done. While we're not catching on the news cycle because of everything else happening. He is single-handedly making our environment, degrading it greatly and ignoring climate change completely.
Yeah, and that's where I find the gap, because obviously people are turned to the news to get their information, but it's so hard when, Mr. Twitter is going off and distracting us. What more can we do to make sure we are focusing on the issues, to make sure that we actually know what the issues are, that bills are being passed? Like, how can they help their representatives? How can people help their representatives with things they do believe in, but maybe they just didn't know? Hey, I could have made a call here or there. What more can we all be doing?
I love that question. So I think it goes two ways, right? Like, I think your lawmaker or whoever your elected official is at any level of government has to be putting themselves out there to be more accessible to you. So I do think it's two ways, right? And we work really hard. We do a weekly newsletter during legislative session that just gives folks the updates of what is happening in session. I always warn folks, I'm like, it's never going to be all encompassing because so much happens. We try to hit the main points that I know our district really cares about. And that's a tool for folks to then get the information and ask those questions and see how they can get plugged in. But then on the flip side, for a constituent to also first identify who your lawmakers are. It's always really interesting how many folks don't know, who is their representative, who's their city official, who's our county official. So I always encourage folks to do those Google searches and just figure out who actually represents you, follow them on Twitter, follow them on Facebook, and set up meetings with them. Like, reach out, have a one-on-one conversation, build that relationship. And then if there are issues you really care about, you'll have a direct line to that person versus not knowing where to go, when a situation arises. So I think you got to make those relationships, reach out in that way. If there's bills you're watching, issues you care about, send that information to that elected official. But again, I think you also have to hold the elected official accountable to being accessible. And we're already scheduling 3 town halls for April. We're putting together programming to talk about session to our district. And I do think every lawmaker should do that, and hopefully we're setting a standard for lawmakers to follow. We had 17 town halls last year, girl. Wow. 17. I mean, it was wild. And so actually there's a group called the Town Hall Project that deemed us as one of the most accessible lawmakers in the country, because we had some of the most town halls compared to others.
And you have good turnout, I know.
We do. People come out. We also bring government to people. Like we go to assisted living homes all the time. So for some folks who can't, leave their residence,
jump in their car,
we come to them. So that's really important too. And so I think that's probably the best ways to get involved. And of course, with campaign season coming, like, volunteer for a candidate you care about. Donate in a way that is meaningful to you. Like, commit to getting involved in this election. Make sure you vote. I think those are some of the more like hands-on ways you can get involved that can be very rewarding as well.
Absolutely. And I think people don't realize that even that volunteer process, just because you volunteer doesn't mean now you're signed up for 7 days a week.
Correct.
I mean, there's very small bite-sized things that people can do.
For an hour a week or something, or an hour a month, like, or
you'll take whatever extra
with the
time.
Text bank. Yeah, any minute. Oh my goodness, that's such a good point. And some of my favorite moments on the campaign trail is supporting introverts kind of become the best door knockers, and it's so they're so stretching themselves and getting out of their comfort zones, and it's really, really cool to see it happen. But even if you're an introvert, who doesn't want to talk to people in that way, you don't have to. There's so many other ways you can contribute where you're still making a big difference, but in a way that you're comfortable with.
Absolutely. I mean, I think this whole, in the beginning I was like, oh, with the texting but honestly, people can see it. It's there. They can decide if they want to be in or out. You don't have to talk to anyone.
100%.
So that everyone gets reached a different way and communicates differently.
And elections have a huge impact. And, on this notion of like Women's History Month, the ERA is a really good example. Virginia just ratified the Equal Rights Amendment, becoming the last state that needs to do that in order for the federal government to officially add language, Equal Rights Amendment, to our federal constitution. And it's only because Virginia flipped their chambers. And they accomplished that in, 4 to 5 years? And that led to the ERA being the last state to ratify the ERA. And when Virginia delegate candidates knocked on doors, they would talk about the ERA and tell voters, hey, if you elect these candidates, the ERA will become a reality. And so women's issues, women's equity became like a political issue of concern for voters. And I think that's pretty cool. And it just reflects the power of women running for office, women of color running for office, and just the change you can see happen overnight when you elect the right people too.
Absolutely. And I know that this is also election year for you.
Oh, yes.
Well.
Oh,
so
yes.
it changes the dynamic of versus you're just like, my feet are in, I'm in the grind, I'm going. But then on the same regard, you have to remind people, hey, if you like what I've been doing, show up with a love.
It's actually a really funny point because so our yard signs are popping back up across our district. And twice now, the city of Orlando has gotten calls asking, basically issuing warnings about our yard signs. Like my house, we got a warning, and I was like, "Why are we getting a warning? We don't have too many excessive yard signs. You're only supposed to have 2 per lot, and we just have 2." And so I played phone tag with the city, and they were like, you have to remove your yard sign. I think it was like a month after your election. I was like, well, I'm running again though. And it was so funny because I don't think they realized hey, we were elected 2 years ago, we're running again. And so to be honest, part of me feels like we've never stopped on the campaign trail. But it was also really funny how city staff don't realize that we run for office every 2 years. They were telling
it goes so
folks,
fast.
It does. It really
so
does.
Fast.
And so reminding voters that we're on your ballot is so important, and folks are very surprised because it does feel like it was yesterday, right?
It does.
And so, we run for office every 2 years, and we're going to be on the ballot with the presidential nominees. I mean, this is a big election year.
It's going to be a long ballot. It's going to
I
have to dedicate a whole day.
Kind of studying and prepping for it. It's so true. And we'll definitely post guidelines as it gets closer to.
That's always super helpful because I always find I'm actually one of those people that want to know every single thing, and I want to research every single person. And I'm like, this is a lot of work.
Every voter. I love it. But you need support though.
It's great if there was a link that just kind of at least gives you an overview, an objective overview, because then people because the verbiage is also tricky.
Gosh, I know.
So I was like, wait, am I for this or not?
It's
so confusing.
Well, Legal and Voters of Florida, they usually have a voter guide that's super insightful and objective.
Okay, we'll definitely link that on this. Yeah.
That would be awesome. And we have a how to vote guide on our website that also walks through getting registered to vote, because we'll make sure you actually are registered, your address is up to date. And we also outline the 3 different ways to vote, because folks don't always know they can vote in person, vote by mail, or early vote. So we always want to also break down, here are the ways you can vote. And then we have a map of our districts so folks know if they live in our district or not. They can figure out, again, who are their elected officials and things like that.
Yeah, I have to admit, I always have to look up the map. Because I'm like, which goes to what, where?
Right,
and I'm like, I don't know what district number I am, so I have to go to look it up.
This year is the 100th anniversary of women voting in this country.
Really?
Oh, yeah. August 26, 1920. When women got the right to vote, I want to be clear, it was mostly white women because we had Jim Crow laws that prohibited women of color from voting until much later in life. In this country's history, I should say. But it still was, 1920 is still a big deal for women's suffrage as a whole. Right. So definitely more reason as women to vote, because this is honoring the women before us who hosted hunger strikes and were imprisoned and faced dangers at the polls for voting.
I'm sure. I can't even imagine it. I mean, I usually do the early, or if I'm out of town, I always do my mailing. I can't even imagine the stress of
Totally.
the polls when at that time, where it was
Oh,
so
yeah.
against it. They really, a lot of men at the time really believed that women had no place in making any decision or anything, and it was just, that's like real, Joan of Arc type,
Totally.
like going into battle for
100%.
everybody else.
100%. Yeah, and those are our ancestors, right? So
Absolutely.
we gotta fight for them and vote for them, and also fight and vote for the future.
Yeah, and there was something I did see also, because we've been talking about all the issues. I know that you had something with the gun laws, gun safety.
Oh, yeah.
I'd like to talk a little bit about that, because I feel like, as well as the distraction and everything, that we always forget, right? So Parkland, everyone remembers it, polls
Right.
but it, the anniversary comes and everyone
Right.
honors, and,
Right.
and that's great. I mean, we
Right.
don't want to not disregard that, but I just feel like, because there's so much in the news cycle, we forget.
Yeah.
And there was a mass shooting, yesterday or something.
days
Yeah.
ago.
I mean, it's
Yeah.
constant. So I know gun safety was a big thing for you, and I know that
Continues to
you
be.
had, and continues to be, and I know you had
absolutely.
some not. I know you had some progress with that this year.
We
so
do.
maybe you can tell me a little bit about that.
Well, so we have filed now 2 years in a row legislation to prohibit those who've been convicted of domestic violence from owning a firearm. And our intention with this legislation is multifaceted, but there's two main objectives. One is to reduce the next mass shooting, because unfortunately we've seen a pattern of mass shooters having some sort of history of domestic violence, and also supporting our survivors of escaping abuse, because research tells us that if there's a gun in your home and you're experiencing domestic violence, it can be 5 times more deadly to leave that home. And so we know that addressing this really dangerous connection between domestic violence and gun violence would help save lives. And so we have filed this bill twice now. It hasn't gone to hearing, but it has built in its grassroots support and its sponsorship support. We're going to file it again next session, assuming that we make it through this campaign and we're back in Tallahassee next year. And the legislative process as a whole, the Senate did move forward a background check legislation to help close the gun show loophole. Unfortunately, it hasn't moved to the Senate floor yet, but that has been at least a historic progress on some sort of gun safety legislation moving the Florida Legislature. But we still have a lot of work to do. And I think what gives me hope is the grassroots support on this issue. Groups like Moms Demand Action, March for Our Lives have really helped to demonstrate an offense to gun safety regulation and are helping to take back the issue and push forward proactive ideas to help reduce violence. And there's been some more dialogue, too, on different types of interventions to reduce community gun violence that we've been very engaged on. And one of them is actually hospital interventions and trying to talk to those who face gun violence, to talk to them about gun violence, because what happens in many cases is that those who were inflicted with a gunshot wound are likely to then potentially become perpetrators because they're seeking revenge, or the only act of expression they know is through physical harm. And so there's been a lot of good studies on hospital-based intervention and helping to prevent community gun violence in the future. So definitely want to see resources allocated to those type of programs. And we've had some great conversations with advocates and legislative colleagues on it, as trying to find, again, those solutions that our Republican colleagues are not afraid of, because I do think Republican colleagues get nervous of being called, anti-gun by the NRA, because that could hurt them in a primary. So trying to give them the courage to challenge the status quo on this, and to also find these solutions that are really common sense when it comes to reducing gun violence long term.
Absolutely. And, on your site, you have these, I think it's like the top 19 or the top list.
19 moments.
19 moments. And I know that you're continuing to have these moments. And for our listeners who haven't seen that, I know we've covered quite a few of them here, but perhaps you could share, a couple of those big moments for you in this amazing journey you've had, and then maybe a couple of the challenges that you'd like to tackle in the time we have, and then hopefully in the future time you're going to have.
I'd love to do that.
Yeah.
I mean, so we're definitely the underdogs in the Florida Legislature. I mean, we're one of 47 Democrats that have 120 members, and so we never really have the numbers to succeed on legislative policy agenda items. But despite the disadvantage, we have really thrived. And I mentioned earlier, securing additional dollars for arts and culture funding statewide. This was a big deal for our district, as we have so many arts communities here that have really struggled with the current state allocations. We were able to increase that by 800%. I mentioned our human trafficking dollars we brought back to the Lifeboat Project here locally. We've also been able to really champion public education issues, become a voice for public education. And then constituent issues. We helped a homeless veteran find a home right here in District 47. We have supported constituents of which issues around traffic, issues around speeding on Lake Conway. We're doing our best from the south side to the north side of our district and east to west to make sure that we're meeting all the unique needs of our constituents and help be by their side in solving different problems. Issues where we are champions and we're still fighting to see progress, of course, include climate change. Yeah. We have filed now 2 years in a row Florida's 100% renewable energy goals bill, and have been really proactive in pushing Florida to wean ourselves off fossil fuels. That bill has not got a hearing yet, but we're having good conversations with Republicans about supporting it. We did file an amendment to a larger bill around net zero for carbon. Mm-hmm. And again, it didn't pass, but it was good to at least force the conversation to our colleagues.
The more we hear about these things, hopefully eventually persisting.
Correct. And the week after we filed that amendment, sure enough, OUC announced that they have a net zero carbon goal, which is a really good step in the right direction. So I do think the more dialogue we have, then the more grassroots support emerges around these type of issues. That will create the public support that pushes industry and pushes other elected officials to pursue smart policy that will protect Florida in the future and give us a clean energy economy. And then, of course, on the affordable housing front, we continue to advocate on protecting the affordable housing trust funds, which is in question right now, and we're going to keep pushing for. Meanwhile, we have seen tiny homes advance in the Florida Building Commission, which was one of our legislative goals last session, to help create formal rules around tiny homes in Florida so that we could see them blossom more. And sure enough, the Florida Building Commission in December 2020 will approve rules for tiny homes, hopefully opening up the door for more neighborhoods to be built that utilize those safety regulations in their construction. So there's been a lot of work. I mean, obviously in the realm of folks from a gender lens, we stand in solidarity with our colleagues on pushing for the ERA in Florida, pushing for equal work, equal pay, domestic violence prevention, sexual assault prevention. Most recently, actually, in the domestic violence world, we played a leading role in holding this coalition called the Florida Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And I won't go into too many details on it, but long story short, this coalition was created by the state of Florida to be the processing arm and the administrative arm for all the domestic violence shelters in the state. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, it became known that the CEO was really paying herself a huge salary. And we issued concerns to the governor's office back in January 2019. And then we sent a letter to the speaker's office and one of our chairmen in October of 2019. An investigation was launched pretty much around November, December. And right now, we're in a place where the coalition has been completely removed from Florida statute, and there's an ongoing investigation to how they spent the public money and what was the impact on survivors in these local shelters. So, I do think some of our work too is just this transparency and accountability piece, and we're really proud to have played a role in that.
Excellent. And I know we got to start wrapping up here, but being in this position, were you surprised? Because I always feel like, those are representatives and they're busy, and most people don't really reach out. But were you surprised by the number of people that do reach out?
Oh, that's a great question. It is wild. I'm always surprised by, and I don't know why I'm surprised by it. I should just, at this point, I feel really, really blessed. But it always comes to me as a surprise. But like I said, we work so hard, so I don't know why I'm always surprised because we get so much love and support from this district. I mean, we get folks that will drive past our volunteers and honk at them and turn around and get a yard sign. And our office attracts so many constituent requests, and sometimes they'll copy multiple elected officials, and we're the only one who respond to them.
Yeah,
right.
I mean, that's a big thing.
I mean, I feel like it's our duty to do that. It's our duty to show up for you. And it can be a little overwhelming. I mean, I get direct messages on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, my personal Facebook, our like public facing Facebook page, my personal Instagram. I mean, like, and then email. So there's like at least 7 ways people talk to me. And it takes a good like 45 minutes just to get through the social media platforms, not even email. I don't even mention text messages. Yes. People text me too. So I do think it's like, I really have to always be on and, kind of push myself to respond quickly, because if I wait, then something else comes up and I get behind. Yeah. So I'm not perfect at it, but I really take that duty seriously to just be responsive to folks.
Absolutely.
And I think that the love shows back. There's many occasions where folks, I talk to them in the digital spaces and I meet them in person, and they just are so grateful that we were there for them. And I'm like, of course, like, not a problem. Actually, I went to this event in Winter Park a few days ago, and it was so sweet. The number of Republicans that thanked me because, like, we showed up for them in some way. And that is so meaningful to me, that here in our district, just whatever the party affiliation is, you don't even have to vote for us. Like, if you call our office, we're going to be there. We're going to show up in some way. And I hope that redefines politics as usual, and challenges the polarization that we see across the country.
Yeah, I am really glad that you kind of explained that process, because you are very probably too accessible for your own like wellness. Yeah, you need some more I saw #self-care in your office.
So funny.
And I'm thinking, how are you reaching out? But it is true. Anytime I've reached out to you, you've been super accessible, and I can see you with your constituents. I see you with the community. And I will be honest, like, I am one of those people, especially after 2016, that was calling, the senator and my house every day, and I will, and not to cause problems with because my politic opinions are my own, but I will say, the Republicans that represent my district, I always got a voicemail. Wow. It was always a voice message. Wow. And I'm like, hey, I want to say, don't vote this on this bill, or vote this for this bill. I know this is coming up. I'm a woman in this district. And I never got a call back. I never get it. It's amazing to me how unaccessible when I meet people that are accessible. It's so refreshing, and
and it should be the standard, right?
It should be the standard, because
standard.
They are working for us, like we
absolutely well, and to reflect that point, well, and literally, like, I have been in those shoes, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's what's so important about electing everyday people into office, because I remember doing the exact thing. I remember leaving voicemails. I remember emailing my state house reps, never hearing back. I remember when I worked in Planned Parenthood and I worked at a nonprofit, contacting elected officials and not hearing back. And I remember how good it felt when someone did respond.
Yeah. And it doesn't have to be you picking up the phone personally. Like, the office has someone and they know what they're talking about.
And it just felt so good. Like, it just felt so... it felt very affirming when, even if they didn't agree with you, to at least get a response back.
Yeah, and that you have a voice.
Right.
And that is the point, I think, in this country, that we forget it's whoever's yelling the loudest or on TV the most has the voice. Whereas, the people do have a voice, and November 2020,
use it. Use it. Absolutely.
Absolutely. But I'm really glad we discussed that, because I think people don't realize how accessible certain candidates are. And so if you really want to test your where you stand, call. Just call and say, hey, what issues are you working on? And see who you get a response from, because it's a big deal. And whatever side, Democrat or Republican, make sure that...
Agreed, because accessibility also transcends party lines. I mean, there are plenty of Democrats in this state, too, that are going to be... that they're not as responsive as us. And I do hope that, like, our efforts, like, our practices... encourage everyday people to ask more of their elected officials, and I hope it also inspires elected officials to mimic it. And I think it is. Like, I've heard from some of my colleagues who really praise our communication with our constituents, and I want to model it. But to be candid, the newsletters I mentioned, it takes me about 4 hours to do those, and I'm going to be working on it this weekend, and probably get it out on Sunday or Monday. And I know that for a lot of folks, they don't have that time, or they don't want to spend that time, and it really go back to this prioritization. Like, I literally have to pause everything else around me to get this newsletter done, but it's so important to me, because what better tool do we have to share with our district what's going on in Tallahassee than some sort of communication digitally? Like, there's there's no reason for me not to do it beyond the time it takes. And I don't think that's a good excuse. And so I take a lot of pride in being able, when I get a question for a constituent, I'm like, hey, actually, we talked about that in our newsletter. Here's the link. Like I love being able to do that.
Yeah, because I know it takes a lot of time, but to me it seems like it obviously saves time because then people can refer to what
Such
you've
a good
already
point.
gone over.
Such a good point.
It's
Such a good point.
You're prioritizing the right way in terms of organization. That's kind of my wheelhouse.
And I hope, I love that point. I
thing.
love that point. And I hope when we model it, others should absolutely mimic it. And it was so funny, actually. I forgot who I was talking to. One of our advocacy groups. It was members of the environmental movement. I ran into them in Tallahassee, and they commented our newsletter for that week and said, I actually just copied parts of it for our newsletter. And I was like, that's amazing. Like, don't reinvent the wheel. And if our newsletter is informational and sums up issues well, like, please cut and paste, don't worry about it. So I like to think we're adding to the larger infrastructure.
So all your work is not
right, totally. Like, cut and paste it.
Be recycled.
Absolutely. Cut and paste it. Use it. Put it on Facebook. You don't have to give us credit. Like, use the information, right? And just feel empowered that the information is there and that you can actually play a role in it.
Yeah. So, well, I don't want to take up much more of your time. You have a lot of stuff to do. You get the 4-hour newsletter. But is there anything else you want to share with our listeners and viewers?
Just encourage folks to keep doing you. And if you want to keep in touch with us, we're on social media, like I mentioned. So Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, On It For Florida. Reach out. And if we could ever be of service to different constituent issues, whether it's something local in your neighborhood or something statewide, like, please contact your local elected official, contact us, and we'll get you connected to the right people to help solve the problem.
All
right. Representative Eskamani, as usual, a pleasure.
Thank you so
much. Get out there and vote. Make sure you're registered. And if you're in this district, vote for Anna.
Oh, thank you for that. And happy Women's History Month.
That's right.
And Women's International Day.
Yes, Women's International Day.
Absolutely. Girl power all the way.
Absolutely.